Hey guys, before we get started on today's episode, if you wouldn't mind supporting the channel just by liking and subscribing, if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just leave a review for us. And even if you're on YouTube, just comment down below what you want us to hear about or what you want us to talk about. It really helps us get even bigger guests and helps us grow even more. If you want to support us on a further level and you live in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area and you want to work with us or just see if we're a good fit, click the first link down below in the description. You'll book a call from the comfort of your own home, get to know us a little bit better, our style, how we plan to sell or help you buy your first home or maybe second home, whatever it might be. We just go over your situation. It's completely free. All right, without further ado, let's get into the episode. All right, guys, welcome back to the Canadian Real Estate Homefront podcast. I'm really excited today. We have Richard Diaz on. He is he's a co-host of the Loonie Hour, which is probably one of Canada's biggest macroeconomic podcasts. He also works with Keith, who's a part of the show as well at IceCap Asset Management, and he just started a new YouTube channel. I believe it is IceCap Asset Management as
No,
the
it's called
title.
the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap. We're still we're
Ice.
still workshopping the title. Keith loves the title. I'm not so keen, but we do really good work there, and it's more detailed. It's shorter, and yeah, I would suggest you guys check it out if you're interested.
Yeah, it's shorter. So it's 10, 20-minute videos, and it's everything about the Canadian economy that's you won't see on the news. So it's actually good stuff. A lot of charts there if you're a macro nerd like myself and Rich. But yeah, Rich, thanks so much for coming on the show. You're not a real estate agent, which is great, which a lot of people don't want to see. Uh, but yeah, today I just want to talk about all things the Canadian economy. So you are a big energy guy and everything like that. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was productivity. So you know what I've learned from your show and other shows. A lot of people like to tell me that I need to go back to school and study economics, but that's okay. You get a lot of haters, even though I did study economics for all the haters out there. Um, they talk about the productivity in Canada. So GDP has been growing, but GDP per capita has just been negative for so long. So the productivity of each person is down. So, I'm a big believer of what you said. I think you and I are both first generation Canadians.
Yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. So we both aren't, as they say, xenophobic or against immigration. We just think that there's probably too much of it. But I'd love to hear your side of it a little bit more in depth and for our audience and kind of what happened to Canada post COVID.
Sure. There's a couple of things to unpack there. Number one, there's different ways to measure productivity. I think GDP per capita is probably the crudest, if that's a word, the most crude way of measuring it. And indeed, that's been down. I think for almost 2 years, we've been suffering sort of a decline, and that's just sort of the recent change. I mean, we've basically been in 2016. Draw the conclusions as you will. Draw conclusions from that as you will. But whereas basically the U.S., for example, has continued us in a material way. And that was not true in the previous 20 odd years. So from 1994 to 2015, 16, US, the US economy's GDP per capita moved with ours in lockstep. They were richer, but our growth, which is, in my view, what matters, was basically in lockstep. And so we've declined. So that's the crude way of looking at it. There's different ways of looking at it. There's something called labor force productivity. So it's a series that Stats Canada pumps out, and it's more sort of specific to sort of how industry is doing, and industry including services relative to the number of workers. So so it's more nuanced. And again, our 5-year compound annual growth rate of that series is negative 0.2. I'm looking at the chart right now. Happy to share it with you if you want. And so it's really tough to get around the fact that our productivity is growing. And as you said, our GDP has been relatively okay. And that's a function of the other piece of the puzzle, which is the population growth. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and again, my parents are immigrants to this country. Immigration's a good thing. I've mentioned it on my videos. I think what matters is, the poisons in the dose. Alcohol is really fun. Not to get you in trouble on your podcast, but if you drink too much, you get sick. And I think that's really the issue we're having. I think for 30 years there was sort of a bipartisan consensus around immigration, excuse me. it was high. I think had they increased it in a more measured or sober way, I don't think we would be having this conversation right now. I think Canada would still be in trouble because of the real estate bubble, and the unwind that always comes after a bubble is painful. But I think the conversations about immigration, asylum seekers, and people cheating these student PR programs, etc. I don't think that would exist if we had been a bit more cautious in our decisions about immigration.
No, that makes sense. So speaking of productivity and real estate, so I agree with a lot what you say that real estate is not. I am a real estate agent, but I think I'm the only person who kind of, not the only person. There's some guys out there, but just thinks that it's highly overvalued when you look at incomes. So that this is what I always look at, right? When I look at the U.S., because people are always like, well, if you measure it in U.S. dollars, okay, I get that. But when you look at the incomes of people in the U.S., they're screaming that there's a bubble and they're about 6x incomes. Canada's about 10x. So what I mean by that is how much you're making versus what's the average price of a home. So we're at 11x. So we're almost double what the US is when you look at incomes. So are we so unproductive that we're not creating these high paying jobs? Or has there just been nowhere for people to invest? So they just invested in housing because it's been a pretty simple game, right? The demand has been so high, but the supply just hasn't kept up. So obviously prices have increased.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to unpack there. I think when I usually make fun of Steve when I say that housing is not, I need to check myself a little bit and be more nuanced in that language. And what I mean to say is, it's throwing bad money after good. So, you need a place to stay, you live, you need your workers to live in a sensible place, hopefully near a factory or near the city where the jobs are created. I think the issue is when you start to sort of over allocate capital to that sector. And the way you might calculate that is, residential capex as a percentage of GDP. And, is it stable over time? Does it accelerate over over a short period of time? And what happens to the rest of the economy during that, period? And I think that's, again, it's, the poisons in the dose, right? So if you allocate a significant portion of your your productive capacity to residential investment, that can be okay. You need people need places to live. If you have lots of population growth, you're absorbing that population growth. The issue happens when you sort of get spikes, and there's different ways to calculate that capex, and one of them is ownership transfer costs, and those are the fees. That's like the extra bit, on top. And we can see during COVID that spiked, and so that money was sort of siphoned away from the more quote unquote productive like allocations of capital, which is equipment, machinery, intellectual property products, which includes research and development and software and non-residential structures. I'm not talking about, it doesn't have to be building stuff. It could be research and development, like I said. And so that's one piece. I think the other part is the other thing I would just caution you is when we say that Canada's 10x or 12x incomes, I would say that that's not evenly distributed. And I would say that some of the cities like Edmonton, Alberta might be like 3 or 4, or Montreal is 6, Ottawa, Gatineau is 5. And that data I'm taking from it's called, you're welcome to look it up. It's called Demographia International Housing Affordability. It's an amazing PDF. It's like 70 pages long, and it's got 60 or 70 or 100 different jurisdictions, and they do like house price to income, or median house price to median household income. And you can see, but you're right. I mean, I obviously you can't disagree with what you're saying, like Vancouver's 12 and Toronto's 11 or 9 or whatever it is, right? So I think the problem is you got to be careful with that distribution, right? It's quite skewed, and I think that often that messes up people's perception. However, on the whole, I think you're 100% right. I think allocating that amount of capital to an asset that's quote unquote non-productive gets you into trouble.
Yeah, no, I dig. Sometimes I feel like I can be in this bubble because I am in Toronto. So that's where, yeah, you do see these incomes spike up, and people are like, well, do you want to see prices fall? Like you're making bigger commission checks, but it's not that, it's that, you look at everyone you went to high school with, or, just friends, and they just go, oh, I'm never going to buy something here. I'd have to move to a different province, which you've seen people do. So you kind of have this Ontario buyer move to Alberta, and then the people who grew up in Alberta or wanted to be close to their parents, now they can't be there anymore either. So you kind of have this way where Canadians are just pushing up housing prices in other provinces.
I guess so, but I mean, I'm a free market guy. I believe that we should let markets decide and people decide, and I don't think. And so what that means is, if people want to move to Lethbridge or Gatineau or Trois-Rivières or whatever it is, so be it. And I think that that's one of the things I think Canadians are sort of reluctant to do. And I'm not sure if it's a cultural thing or if maybe it's just because of temperatures and our geology, not geology, our geography. But like, in the US, you've got a bunch of sort of these secondary cities, the San Antonio, Richmond, Jacksonville, Austin, Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm just trying to like these off the top of my head,
Yeah.
of these secondary cities that you can actually make lots of money and send your kids to good schools, and that you don't have to live in Houston or New York or Los Angeles. And I think that what I hope for like the next 50 or 100 years is the Canadians feel much more comfortable moving to these second and tertiary cities because there's opportunities there, because capital has been encouraged to flow there, and along with capital comes jobs and et cetera. And maybe that's a way of improving our productivity. If some, what I mean, if Red Deer, Alberta becomes more productive, and I think that's good for Canada. So I don't know. I have misgivings about that kind of view.
No, I definitely see your point. I don't think anyone, well, some people would, but I don't think that what you're saying is wrong.
Well, I mean, it
So
might be wrong, but that's just my view.
yeah, yeah, no, I think that's what everyone always used to say, right? Like if you want to be in banking, you got to come to the financial sector in Toronto, and that's the only way to do it. But I guess, now with COVID and people working remote, you could actually go
Yeah.
somewhere. I think you work remote too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, my boss Keith is in Halifax. I'm here, and we have another colleague also in Halifax. But instead of moving downtown to be close to some office, I'm a little bit on the outskirts of the city, and for me, it's worked really well. I mean, I don't know how that's going to play out. I think cities exist for a reason. Whether it's Rome or Carthage or Istanbul, there's a reason that people congregate around one another. But I also think that sometimes in certain countries you can exaggerate that. So, for example, the UK is a really interesting example where it's something like 20% of the UK's GDP comes from London. And if you know London, there's like a ring road. It's called the M25, which is the name of the highway that circles London. And something like 22% of all of the UK's GDP is within this tiny block. And although it's obviously a powerhouse with respect to GDP per capita and productivity and taxes and schools and whatever, it also the country's lopsided. Do you know what I mean? And whereas again, I would submit the US, which is, I get it, a larger geographical area, but has a bunch of secondary cities that really do act as counterweights, both from an economic standpoint and a political standpoint, that I think are helpful for sort of the evolution of a country. But I don't know, maybe I think too much about those things.
No, I think it's good to think about these things. I wanted to ask you, so we were speaking kind of before we hopped on here. You're telling me about nuclear and these ideas behind energy, and energy seems to be this big thing between the left and the right. Like, Trudeau is always saying, well, Pierre Poilievre, you don't care about Canada, like you don't care about climate change. And then Pierre goes, no, I'm going to invest in technology like nuclear and stuff like that. And the liberals have, they want to make electric cars, the only type of cars that you can drive by
But they
2035.
just put tariffs on the Chinese
On the
imports,
Chinese.
though.
They did. I know,
100% tariffs, by
they
the
just
way.
made it more expensive for Canadians to buy the Chinese cars. I guess you could, what's the argument? Is that more cars get made here in Canada? Is that the argument?
I thought the argument was to save the world from climate change. So
Anyways, what's your idea behind all this? What's the best energy source for Canadians that not only is okay or good for the environment, but also can put paychecks on Canadian, it can feed Canadians, it can put paychecks in their bank account, it can put food on the table. Because I think this transition away from oil, what are we, the fourth biggest producer of oil? But I think this transition away from natural resources has maybe been kind of what has put us in this productivity spiral? Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but what are your thoughts?
I think that's part of it. I think if you look at when I think that's part of it. I think that, I mean, there's a bunch. I don't think there's like a particularly right answer. I think that there's, some might claim that Canada suffers from Dutch disease, which is because because we export so much oil, it artificially increases our currency, the value of our currency, which makes the exports of our other manufactured goods and services more expensive than they otherwise would be. So and then, that basically can kill off those other industries. That's called the Dutch disease. Um, that's one angle. The other angle is that Canada is a resource extracting nation. That's the only reason you would live in a place where it's cold and shitty half the time, is because there's an incredible amount of value under our feet and on the surface. And to pretend like not exploiting that is the most obvious way to improve Canada's either, lot in life, or improve people, improve our standard of living, is, to me, it is kind of dumb. It smacks of sort of an arrogance, of like, a big city arrogance, where you don't want to get your hands dirty, whether it's on a farm or in a mine or whatever. So that's the other thing. I think that the idea, there's a bunch of stuff, if I may, to unpack there. I mean, the idea that Canada is gonna, transition away from fossil fuels is a fantasy. We are the fourth largest producer of oil in the world after the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. We export 4.5 million barrels of oil a day. Oil consumption globally is going up. That industry does not employ very many people because it is highly productive. And, once you set a rig, or, set up your refinery, or you set up your well, you don't actually have to employ that many people. However, it generates an incredible amount of hard currency, and e.g. US dollars, and that hard currency flows in and and allows us basically to pay for a huge amount of imported goods. And so Canada does export some goods, but what matters, when you're thinking about currencies and balance of payments and that kind of stuff, is about the net exports. And our net exports, basically our export of oil roughly offsets our imports of all other goods. And that keeps our current account balance in balance, basically around zero, which is excellent, because services are roughly the same. And, the other bits, don't worry about that. And so what that means, if tomorrow Canada stopped exporting oil, we would have to have a massive an internal devaluation, meaning we would have to consume a lot less products and services from outside Canada, or two, we would have to have an external devaluation, meaning our currency would have to go much, much, much lower. And either way, it would be very painful. And so remember that Canada is a very heavily indebted country, one of the most heavily indebted country in the world. We have bad productivity. Do you know what I mean? So it's a fantasy, basically. It's a fantasy that I think well-meaning people tell themselves because they're hyper focused on climate change, which to me is neither here nor there. I think the reason I get my backup, and I really care about this, is because people in Ottawa are not the MPs and ministers of the world. They're the MPs and ministers of my mother and your mother and the guy who lives in, Red Deer, to use that example again, and Toronto and Victoria and Nanaimo. And their job is to improve our standard of living, and they answer to us first and foremost as, our elected representatives. And so this idea, you know what I mean? And so that's where I sort of get, annoyed. And then the secondary thing is, like, fossil fuels writ large are useful. They're reliable, they're abundant, they're relatively cheap, they're available, they don't explode, they most of the time, unless they're under pressure. But you know what I mean? And they're relatively safe. And so if you're going to have a substitute, well, it better be a freaking amazing one.
Hmm.
And you're not gonna get people to want to be poorer. And I think that that's the problem, that there's no admission, or I would say that until recently there's been no sort of admission that to wholesale shift our entire economy to renewable resources when frankly we're just not ready means a lower standard of living, less industry or no industry. Do you know what I mean? And so and I find that so that that combined with the flat out blanket disregard of nuclear power, which has been around since the 60s. I just find it falls flat as far as I'm concerned. If Canada wants to transition away from fossil fuels, well, then we should have a massive, coordinated, and systemic investment towards nuclear power or hydro to make the fossil fuels obsolete from a demand perspective and not, you know what I mean? And you know what I mean? And so that's because the other thing we often don't think about, we think of energy in terms of, turning on the lights and running fridges. But energy is very, very important from an industrial perspective, whether it's making steel, whether it's, transporting goods across country, whether it's running data centers. Those are extremely, so if you're obsessed with being tech heavy, well, then you need a data center. You need a lot of energy. So the idea that you can sort of renewable energy your way through this, I mean, wind and solar, hydro is excellent. Is to me just without the appropriate storage, that's grid, like that's insufficient for your entire grid. We're talking like millions and millions of terajoules of energy. I just didn't think it's not a cogent analysis of where we are and where we want to be. I think it's very much fanciful. And I think the worst part is the people who make those decisions never suffer the consequences of those decisions, if that makes any sense.
And they don't suffer because they are just well off to begin with. Is that kind of the idea?
I mean, they are, yeah, but they don't, for example, an MP is not running a steel mill in Hamilton,
Mm,
or a data center in Toronto, or, they don't, they're separated from the pain. You know what I mean?
right.
So and so that's the issue. The other thing that I think that people often forget is that like other countries don't care about the environment as much as we do. And what that tells me is that it's very much a luxury belief. And so there's two ways you can treat that luxury belief, meaning only people who have enough money and time to think about these sort of existential questions are the ones, whereas like if you're a poor country, you're just trying to feed your kids and house your family and, educate and try to, improve that standard of living. And so the issue I have there is that, you can't make people want to go backwards in terms of standard of living. You just can't. And so and it's a luxury belief because, we are afforded to be kind of callous because we're so rich. Does that make sense? And the way I
Yeah.
describe it to my friends is we're sort of like we're like a college trust fund baby. That kid you went to college with who's like didn't really have to work very hard because his parents were rich.
Yeah. I call it backing up the truck in daddy's garage.
Yeah, so I mean that's what Canada is. I mean,
Mm,
ultimately, and in a way, and it's shame because I'm very proud to be Canadian. My parents are very very proud to be Canadian. I want this country to be everything that it can be, but we need to start realizing that we don't really. We just like we sit on this oil reserve, basically on these oil reserves. We're the third largest oil reserves in the world with 160 odd billion barrels of oil. And then, we don't really do much with it. So you know what I mean? And so it's a sort of fascinating dichotomy between I don't think it should be a left or right issue. That's sort of the irony of all of it. It's like, do you want to emancipate the working class? Do you want well-funded schools and a well-funded healthcare program? And well, then we should exploit our natural resources in an ethical and sustainable way and be custodians of our environment, not just try to wholesale destroy an industry that is effectively keeping the world alive. So that's my view. I mean, I know there's people with differing views, and that's fair enough, but I see it from a working class perspective. I see from an inflation perspective, a currency perspective, a balance of payments thing. And the reality is that, for all the talk of renewable energy, and yes, it's true that it's a growing portion of our total energy consumption, production. That's undoubtedly, it's growing and growing, growing. The absolute number of fossil fuel consumption globally is rising.
Right. So more people
And
are
so,
using oil.
no, but more people are using natural gas. Coal is having a resurgence,
Mm.
especially in emerging markets, because it's cheap, abundant, easy, safe. And until you create a substitute, a real proper substitute, not, you know, if it's sunny outside, then it's a good, I mean, a on 24 hours a day, enormous amounts of stable baseload power substitute, you're never going to move away from fossil fuels. And I think I think the lie that we've been told is that the transition to renewables would be painless. And that's just not true. And I don't have any skin in the game. If tomorrow aliens landed from planet Earth and like had a microwave that created all this energy and obviated fossil fuels with the snap of a finger, I'd be fine. I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly attached
Yeah, you
to.
don't own an oil rig or
I
anything.
don't
You're just,
care
yeah.
about the fossil fuels. What I care about is Canada. I care about working class people. I care about feeding the world. I care about housing them in a warm, safe, dry place. And so if tomorrow aliens come down and come with technology that makes all of the fossil fuels in the world completely, it obviates all of that, then fine, great. But until then, I think this idea that we're just going to move away from it painlessly, I think is just an outright lie. Yeah, I know I have sharp views on that, but I've spent a lot of time reading and thinking about it. And maybe I'll be proven wrong in 10 years from now. You have me on the podcast and say, Rich, you're an
Yeah.
idiot. And I'll be
Hopefully,
happy to take my lumps.
hopefully AI doesn't replace us by then. But that's why I wanted you on the podcast, because I wanted to talk about energy, because I think it's we always talk about real estate in Canada and the bank stocks. And I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about like the natural resources. So you said something interesting, which was people don't want their standard of living to decline. Now,
That's
correct me
fair.
if I'm wrong, but I think over the last 3-4 years since COVID, people's standard of living have kind of gone backwards, right? Like, I think that you're seeing more people in homeless shelters, you're seeing more people line up at food banks, and inflation has a lot to do with it, I think. But I've got another question after that, but I wanted to know what you think about that. Do you think people's standard of living, I think as technology and everything progresses, we should see people accelerate. You should see the world do better. But I feel like in Canada specifically, and I'm lucky to be here, I know that, but I feel when you look at the broader tone of people's voices, how much money they're making, their housing, that they feel like life has gotten harder. Groceries have gotten more expensive, gas has gotten more expensive, and they were better off 3 years ago than they were today.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. I think that more than being a function of like bad political decisions, although that is tempting, I think it's a function of the fact that we're dealing with about housing, not bust, because it's more, what was those toys that when you sat on them, they like slowly fizzled and then they made all these farting noises? A whoopee cushion.
Whoopee cushion, yes.
Right? Like, so, you can have a housing pop, which is what the US did. And in 2 years, you had your housing prices fell 30, 40%, even 50% in some jurisdiction. That happened in Ireland. That happened in Spain, some parts of Portugal a little bit. But that's not happening in Canada. We're having more of a housing whoopee cushion, you know what I mean? Where you're seeing but I think you need a recalibration, and that recalibration can often be painful. And I think it takes time. I think the issue with Canada is the productivity piece. I think that to me, it's inextricably linked to people's standard of living. I think if you improve productivity in a country, the standard of living will rise. I think that in my view, those are linked. I think maybe some economists disagree. I'd be happy to hear their counter argument. And then, in Canada, we're having a real dearth of business investment. So outside of the energy space, which is basically, at a 20-year low as far as capital expenditures, we have basically stopped investing in real terms in this country. So how do I know that? If you look at residential sorry, if you look at non-residential capex in real terms, we're back to 2012 levels. I mean, and then, the counter argument to that was like, well, Rich, our economy has shifted towards services and is more consumption based. And that's okay. That's a fair counter argument. But the issue is that our debt servicing ratios are very, very high. So if you're going to consume, you need money to consume. How do you improve your money? You either become more productive or you work harder, or you have less debts to service. But we've sort of done the opposite. We have more debt to service because, we have high debts, we have higher interest rates. And so it's like, it's a confluence of many, many things. I hate people who sort of say it's just one thing. I think that's always gets you into trouble. I think it's a confluence of these different factors.
Okay, cool. So I agree with you. If you become more productive, your society will become better overall. I just think there'll be more jobs, there'll be more abundance. So you did say one thing though about housing kind of not being the trigger of it all, but there is no doubt that housing is a huge part of people's incomes that they need to service, right? CMHC says it should be 30% of your income, and it's 60 plus for a lot of people. Some people it's even more. And then you just have people who their debt just becomes so much where they can't even afford it, and now they're living in tents in the park beside my place in Toronto. But I wanted to ask you this. I've watched The Big Short so many times. I don't think history repeats, but sometimes it can rhyme. What do you think about Canadian real estate prices, where they are today and where they could go in the future? Do you think we're looking at, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think we could be looking at a situation where this bubble could pop and we could go from, 700,000 being the median price down to 500,000? Or would that just be way too detrimental? Because it seems like every time we have a drop in real estate prices, the government comes in and says, okay, we'll give you more cheap debt. We'll increase the amortization for you. You can afford $1 million home now. Let's make it 1.5 million. So do you think it's just this bubble that they won't let burst?
Yes. Yes. In short term, I think politically, by the way, I don't think this is, specific to one party or the other. I think this is a bipartisan agreement that they shall never let the real estate bubble burst. I think the problem is with, best laid plans. I think sometimes things just will happen regardless of your efforts to counter them or not. So that's, warning to people about that. I think, so that's the first part of your question, which is, do I think there's any political appetite to let that happen? No. I think there's probably two reasons. One, simply votes. And two, a lot of people have, in my view, mistakenly used their home as their savings account. And it's not
or an ATM.
Their fault. Or their ATM, excuse me. Or it's not their fault. The government has they have every incentive to do so,
Yeah.
Whereas I think that, instead of starting businesses or investing in the equity market or, God forbid, buying bonds, they think, well, where's the best return on my investment? My home. I'm going to invest in my home. And so you do that one generation, two generations, three generations, you now have a huge chunk of the population who has every incentive to keep that bubble from popping. Very dangerous. It's dangerous from a societal perspective because, often we talk about left and right and rich and poor. In my view, that those are bad characterizations. It's like asset owner versus people who don't own assets. That's the real bifurcation in Canada. It's not East Coast to West Coast. It's, do you own a home? Do you not own a home? And I think that's, in my view, personally, that's where a lot of the fault lines are drawn. And that's where a lot of the problems are. So do I think but back to your question, do I think the median household will fall by 30%? I don't, not in nominal terms. In Ireland, in the US, you had a nominal decline or in Spain, you had nominal declines of 30, 40%. I don't really see that happening. I see more years of middling growth, like crappy growth in the housing market, and incomes that catch up.
Does that mean the dollar devalues though?
No, it doesn't have to. No, I'm talking because that's internal. That's internal. That's
So you
internal
see
in
wait,
Canada.
like, I always look at the 90s kind of maybe as an indicator of what we can see today, because technically from the top of COVID, a lot of areas are down 15-20%, which is quite a huge haircut
Really?
for.
Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, I called them the COVID darlings of Ontario, where people
So
would
is
want
that
to.
Brampton and all those people? Like,
Yeah, as an example, like London,
okay, right.
Woodstock is an example. So people from Toronto would sell the home here, and they go bid up these places in Woodstock because they thought, I'm never coming back to the city. COVID's
Right.
over. I'm going to buy this piece of land, until they got called back to the office. So then they'd have to try and offload the Woodstock place or the place in
Got it.
London, Ontario. I think Kitchener-Waterloo has also seen some pretty big
Okay.
declines. Oakville, Burlington, Hamilton, even like really solid areas.
Okay.
Um,
Well, then
but
I mean that shows you that maybe I'm wrong about that. I mean, maybe you do have a decline in nominal terms. I think I mean the problem is that you have this massive population growth thing screws everything up, and it really it's difficult to have any kind of price discovery. You can the problem with economics and life in general is because you can never do sort of a counterfactual. Like if we didn't have a tripling of our immigration over the last 3 years, our run rate was about 320 odd thousand people, more or less. And then we popped up to like, 600,000 over, from 2015 to 2020, let's say, COVID notwithstanding. And then we popped up to even, 1 million, let's just say, keep numbers easy. Had we not had that run up, I would, I imagine we would have had a significant nominal decline in house prices. But we didn't, and we don't. So you know what I mean. And so it's it's
mhm.
it's a really really challenging question. If population growth stays at 3% with the number of housing starts being what they are and basically haven't changed in 30 years, it's supply, demand, prices, right? So it's really hard for me to envision a time where housing just has a wholesale collapse. Another thing that we often forget about housing is, or sorry, you probably know this better than I do, actually, which is like if you have really low vacancy rates, then rents are going to be high, and can't you back out a house, you're like a cap rate based on rental income?
Yeah, so this is where I would say to somebody, like, what's the bear case for Canadian real estate? And it would be the decline of the population growth, because these rents don't make sense in a lot of places, because to service them, it's too expensive. But once you put 20 international students in
No,
Brampton,
but that's just the story. I
no,
mean,
but yeah,
most households have two or three people in them.
yeah, most households do, but it doesn't make sense today. You could not buy a condo unit in Toronto and it even break even,
Yeah.
because
Well,
the interest
yeah.
rates don't make sense. So the bear case is that rents start to fall because population growth has declined, and then people can't afford to, they can't hang on anymore, because there's a lot of investors, let's just say it, in
Mhm.
Canada, and they're
Yeah.
forced to offload, because we've seen in places like Kingston, Ontario, at Queen's University, they're saying, where's my students? Like, there was an article that said that, like, they've never had issues in the last 5 years renting out these places, and now they're having issues because they can't get the tenants in there. So that's where
Okay.
I could see the market dropping further, is if investors were forced um to sell. But then you have this other issue where, okay, now rates are coming down, and you're starting to look at rates in the four handles, and we're going to get down in the threes. And then
Yeah.
you could see more people start to come back in if the numbers start to make more sense. So I'm kind of this mindset, is that I think it's going to be like the 90s when I look at history, is that just trade sideways.
That's how that would be my view. That
Yeah.
would be my view, and
Yeah.
that's why I mentioned the income piece. So you talked about affordability, and there's different ways, as you know. Sorry if maybe this is for the benefit of your audience, but
Uh,
you can do median home price to median income. You can do median or rent to income as a different way. And so for me, do I think that like Vancouver or Toronto gonna go from 10 to 5? No, I highly doubt that. I think you could go from like 10 to like 8 or 10 to 9. But in the scenario that you described, which is your house prices are relatively flat, but it's your incomes that start to ratchet higher in nominal terms over time. But that would be that's my best guess. That's not an exciting kind of,
Yeah, it's
people want to
boring.
hear,
Yeah.
people want to hear like fire and brimstone. Well, that's not my view, like I have very sharp views about energy on the housing market. I think it's going to be more of the same, really. I mean, Canada's a great place to live when we're not run by idiots. And I think that it's a beautiful country, the weather notwithstanding. There's lots of room here. It's relatively safe. You know what I mean? And so I'd imagine that people are going to still want to come here. And until we can get more shovels in the ground to build more homes, that supply demand imbalance is going to persist. And that means prices, it's very hard to envision like a wholesale collapse in prices, in my view.
No, I agree. And especially what they build, right? Especially these days. It's not like when you look at housing starts, it's not like they're building these 3 bedroom townhomes
Right.
where yeah,
That's such an important point because when you
mhm,
started interrupting, but that's such an important point because when you look at how at one point in this country we built more single family homes than
homes.
we did
Yeah.
condos.
Yeah.
It's
100%.
totally like I was gonna drop an F bomb. It's totally screwed up. It's like it's wild.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. Like 20, I think it was like 2002, we built more single family homes than condos.
It's crazy.
And then
Peterborough,
people
Ontario?
wonder, sorry?
Have you ever heard of Peterborough, Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, I know that like
Yeah.
hockey players come from there.
Yeah, yeah. So there's not a lot of people there, but they built more, I think it was last year, they built more 3 bedroom homes in the city of Toronto. So you can see what product Toronto's building. They're building these bachelor pads. They're building, let's stuff as many people as we can into these. And I understand there's land issues and there's density.
Yeah, I
I
get
get it.
it.
But
But I
I'm
can
just
tell
saying,
you, people talk about birth rates collapsing in Canada, and I just bet you, I don't know. Again, there's no counterfactual. I can't prove this hypothesis, but I suspect that if there was an abundance of like single family, what is it detached? Detached means when they're stuck together, right?
uh detached
Like
is like
row
the
houses,
yeah,
like
row houses are
like
yeah, they're like
townhouses.
townhomes.
If there was like an
Yeah.
abundance of townhouses or semi-detached houses, or God forbid, a standalone home, I think people would be that were relatively affordable. I think people would have more kids because they would feel like they could afford to have them in a place that was like a decent place to have. You know what I mean? But because
100%.
that's my, I can't,
There's no
can't predict.
data. Yeah. Yeah.
There's no data to. That's like quite the grand hypothesis. So please don't at me. But that I suspect that that's probably part of the
No,
reason
yeah,
why
I've
we have.
I've said that too, and I've gotten heat for it, but that's my view. And anecdotally, like I have tons of young friends, and it's the same thing. Trying to have a wedding is $100,000, and then trying to save $200,000 for a house, and then thinking about paying for kids. By the time you stack it all, you're not left with a lot of money at the end of the day. So,
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of just ask you a few more questions here, just to
Yeah.
wrap up.
Shoot.
So we were talking about resources, right? What do you think about, and I don't want you to get added at, but what do you think about the carbon tax, right? Is that really like something that could help us, or is it just pushing up gas? Because we have all this oil. Like, why are gas prices so expensive? Why are things so expensive in this
Two
country?
reasons. One, taxes.
Hmm.
Most of the price that you pay at the pump is taxes.
It's like 60%, isn't it?
I don't know the exact
Something
number,
like
but
that.
I
Yeah.
just know. And so I don't know if it's not most, very, it's a non-trivial sum of that number.
Hmm.
The second reason is because we don't refine enough of our own oil. So
Right.
that's my view. Now, an energy expert might come on and say that I'm wrong, but my view is that we don't refine enough oil. So Canada's refining capacity or throughput, whatever you want to call it, is about 1.82 million barrels of oil a day. So in the 80s, we would produce 2 million barrels of oil. We would consume a tiny bit of that, and then we would refine almost, a bunch of it. Now we produce about 5 million barrels a day. We refine about 2, and we consume about 2, um, more or less. And so we don't, and that's partly a function of two things. One is that we produce what's known as heavy crude oil, and that although that has a lot of like industrial uses, what's really the sort of the best quote unquote oil to produce is something called light sweet. But even then, that's not perfect. You need to like mix it with heavy crude then you need to refine it. And then once you refine it, you get all the, the smorgasbord of different products. So you kerosene, bitumen for the roads, you get diesel, you get petrol, you get all these different types of things. And so that's the like so that's one of the reasons really. Like I think it's a complicated industry that I try to understand well. Um, but so because we don't really produce, and so what we do is so sorry to finish that up. So the US has 18 million barrels of refining capacity roughly. And so we actually send our oil, our crude oil down. The US refines a lot of it. We refine a bit too, but the US refines a lot of it. And then they mix it with the light sweet bit. They get gasoline and then they ship it back up to us, as I understand it. Of course, that's not a perfect explanation because we obviously refine plenty of it here. And it depends where you're on the East Coast and West Coast. And if, on and on it goes. But basically, there's a lot of frictional costs to that refining piece, which impacts the price of gasoline. But really, I think that in a way, that big, long, convoluted explanation is really, in a sense, a red herring, because if taxes were cut tomorrow by 40%, then our gasoline would be cheaper,
Right.
right? So the actually the sweet irony is that we generate so much revenue from oil, and they want us to stop using oil. So it's be interesting, but yeah, it's just taxes. I would say it's mostly
Taxes. Yeah.
taxes.
Interesting. Okay.
The
Rich,
carbon
man.
the carbon tax
Go ahead.
itself. Sorry, one last thing. The carbon
Yeah.
tax
Yeah. Go
itself,
ahead.
I think, is a very useful political hammer. I think, although, do I like? There's two things that you need to separate. One, do I think a carbon tax is a good idea? No, I think that's stupid. But two, do I think it has anywhere near the negative impact that Pierre Polyev is like trading on? No, I
Probably
also
not.
don't
Yeah.
think that. I think it's like more power to the guy. He obviously understands. He can obviously get the pulse of the nation pretty well. So he's probably, God willing, he'll probably be the next prime minister. Who knows? Whatever. But the way he described, he makes up. He really, really lays it on thick with the carbon tax. Now, again, that's not to say that I think it should exist, but he's getting a lot of mileage on that, is the way I would say.
Yeah.
Is that is
He's
that
he's he's
fair?
good. Yeah. He's good at his slogans. That's for
Is that
sure. I
fair? I
agree
mean,
with you.
what do you think
I
about
think
it?
it's fair. Yeah, no, I think it's totally fair. Like I don't think I think that he's hitting on the standard of living that Canadians, and he does really well. If you worked hard and you wanted to come to Canada, you could afford a home, you could afford a good life, and that's not happening. And he's just resonating with a lot of people, and that's why it's evident in the poll numbers, right? Like people
Yeah.
still say Trudeau might get in, and if you look at the poll numbers, it's impossible. Like you need for a
Nothing's
majority,
possible. Nothing's
yeah,
impossible.
nothing's impossible, but you need for a majority, you need 170 seats, and Pierre's got like 220 plus already. So
So,
he would
but
need
I
a
want to
huge decline.
I want to temper everybody's expectations about him to come in and so far what I hear from him, so good. But I think he's about to inherit a shit sandwich.
Yeah,
And I think this idea that he's gonna roll in and do
save the day.
tinker on the
Yeah.
edges and save the day, I think is I think that if I were him, I would on day one. I would temper expectations, because I think we still have a lot of issues. We talked about productivity, we talked about lack of investment, we talked about, you know, we talked about lack of housing that eats up a lot of the excess savings that people have. You know what I mean? I think we have this
Mm.
population problem that I don't think it's going to go away. And people are like, oh, it's going to just disappear. The population growth is going to disappear. Maybe, maybe not,
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of problems that he's inheriting that, not to be a political strategist, because God knows I'd be the worst politician ever, but I think he's about to take a big bite out of a shit sandwich. And if all of us are like, we want hope and change, and I'm just saying we should all temper our expectations for what this man can deliver.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. No, Rich, I really appreciate you coming on. This was great. I'm gonna tag everything down below. I'm gonna tag Steve's channel with the Loonie Hour and your new channel that you have there, because I think it's great too. So I appreciate everything. I can put your email down there too. We'll talk after. But thanks so much for coming on, man. I think the audience is really gonna love this one.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Hopefully I did a good job, and I'll be
You did
happy
a
to,
great job. No, it was awesome.
if I did, I'd be happy to come on anytime.
Awesome. Okay, I'll take you up on that.
Cool. Cheers.
Okay, thanks, Rich.